Well, welcome to Washington Policy Center's On the Go event. This is David Bose. I am the Communications Director for Washington Policy Center. I'm sorry about the delay. We were trying to fix a one of the challenges here is our video was locked out, but I think I've just fixed that technical challenge where cameras will be enabled for our guests. So with that, sorry for the delay. Usually we try to stick to an exactly 12 o'clock schedule, but today we're just a little bit behind. Now, as you know, the legislative session has started. We've got a lot of guests today, including our director for our Center for the Environment, Todd Myers, our director for our Center for Healthcare, and the director for our Center for Worker Rights, Elizabeth Hovde, our director for the Center for Government Reform, Jason Mercier, and our Center for Education Director, Finne. And I wanted to start with Liv because she's very passionate and animated this morning, having had a lot of action and testifying already before the legislature. Liv, there's a couple of different things I wanted to address with you. And let's start with a proposal that I heard you mention today regarding cutting one day off of the school week. Tell us about that proposal and where it is.
Yes, this is the bill, Senate Bill 5735, which will be heard in the Senate Education Committee tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. And it is a proposal by Senator Dingra from the Kirkland area legislative district. And the proposal is to define an instructional hour to allow school districts to cut 20% of teacher contact time with their students. I call it the No School on Friday bill. It is a leftover from the emergency rules that they passed during the COVID school shutdown. The State Board of Education and OSPI passed a regulation allowing for what they call asynchronous learning, which is they defined synchronous learning as a live teacher over Zoom instructing children, and asynchronized learning as students doing homework. And teachers were allowed to use asynchronous learning time to count towards their workday. And now, that rule was passed by the State Board of Education early on in the COVID shutdown, and then made permanent for this school year. And now they're trying to codify this into law. And so I think it's an outrage. I think it's stealing instruction time away from students. It's stealing money from, the state taxpayers provide $17.5 billion a year in public funding and public taxes to support the schools. And it's taking away from them. And it's also another instance of a state agency overreaching its authority by writing rules to define instructional hours that is clearly not their providence. This is their province, their bailiwick.
Their scope of authority. So
Yeah.
just to make sure I understand what you're saying in a nutshell, what they would do is make it so that if students were assigned homework and the kids are doing this homework and the teacher's no longer on the video, directing them, but has kind of left them to their own devices, this would still count as instructional hours.
Yes.
So
exactly.
you get assigned 4 hours and you've got, you don't have to be there really.
Exactly. No, assigning homework, the students working on their homework counts towards the teacher's workday. And this up to 20% of the time that the teachers spend in school. So it's easy. 20% of a 5-day work week is a whole day, which would mean school districts, and you have been noticing, Dave, there have been districts calling for a 3 or 4 day weekend with no notice recently. It happened over the Thanksgiving weekend and there was the schools of 98,000 students were closed, for a 4-day weekend. This is part and parcel, an expression of this rule in the districts, how they're interpreting it. And I just think it's an amazing chutzpah on their part. Are we going to defend the system of public education or not? I mean, this is going to be a hot hearing. I'm hearing parents are getting ready to testify tomorrow. There's going to be an outcry from parents who are so angry that this is being done to their children. It was done for 13 months during the COVID school shutdown, and now they're going to make this permanent. I mean, really.
So is there is going to be a hearing on it, but it's not a piece of legislation, right? Am I understanding that correctly? Or it
Oh,
is
no,
a piece of-
there is this piece of legislation, Senate Bill 5735, which would essentially codify the State Board of Education's rule defining an instructional hour that a teacher is paid to provide students as including this asynchronous learning by so 20% of a teacher's contact time with kids, I'm sorry, 20% of a teacher's contact time with kids will now be counted if this bill passes towards this asynchronous learning, which is just an outrage. I'm sure this is, I haven't seen anything like this in looking at state policy across the nation. This would be a first.
I like the way it's given this kind of unnecessarily complicated name, so that it sounds very intellectual and out there instead of, it's basically kids doing homework,
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
and so that'll be fascinating. When's that hearing coming up, Leave?
That's tomorrow morning at 10:30 before the Senate Education Committee.
And, not to put too fine a point on it, is there a list of signees for that already building, or is that?
Oh, I know that Jason, my colleague Jason, has put a terrific piece up on our website saying how to sign up for remote testimony. And if you go to that piece, you can get to the link to sign up very easily.
Yeah, excellent.
But you need to do it more than an hour before the hearing. So you have to sign up before 9:30 tomorrow morning if you want to testify.
And just a word of recommendation for folks, because a hearing like this that's controversial, and that there'll be a lot of proponents trying to stack the deck, to get their message out there. If you want to make sure your voice is heard, you should also prepare them in writing so you can submit them both in writing and orally if you get that chance to do so. What about critical race theory, Leave? Is there any new movement on that, one way or the other, in the legislature right now?
Yes, there are two good bills out there. One bill is House Bill 1807, which is Representative James Walsh's bill to provide a quality, rigorous civics education to Washington State students. And I'm just looking over that bill. I'm hearing it might get a hearing before the House Education Committee, and I'm very encouraged by that because it would defend, honesty and integrity in teaching history to our students, which critical race theory does not do. There's another bill, House Bill 1886, introduced by Representative Clippert, which would ban the teaching of critical race theory in the schools. Both bills would prohibit the state from teaching that one race or sex is superior to another, that the U.S. is structurally or systemically racist, all that nonsense that these radical educators have put into our curriculum. They are lowering the academic learning standards for students by, and this is in the curriculum in Washington State. No matter how many people tell you it's not there, it is being taught right now. And it is distracting students from the important academic skills they need to acquire to succeed in life. And, you might have noticed last week, Dave, that the state test scores have come out. November 2021 were finally released, and they show that the legacy of the COVID school shutdown and this diversion from rigorous academic instruction in the subjects has caused 70% of the state's students to flunk the state math test, and 53% of the students have flunked the state English test. This is the emergency in front of us, and I'm very concerned about it. And so both these bills to end this distraction, this radical distraction, it would be a good move forward for Washington State, I think.
And one other thing that always strikes me about this is even when test scores change over time, you have to remember it's not the same kids, right? So this generation of kids that loses and falls behind stays behind as they go forward, and that leaves them at a disadvantage and can frustrate their ambitions and achievement later on. So that's something
exactly right. That's the problem with education. It's like a train. I've explained this before, that if you're a third grader who lost the third grade during the COVID school shutdowns, you are now have been put into the fourth grade. and you didn't get that necessary information and skills and knowledge that you needed to succeed in the fourth grade because your school was shut down during the third grade. And I don't see much effort being, of course, individual teachers are trying to help their kids catch up. But as an institution, the public system is not doing it. It's not doing that. So it's a very serious matter. We should be. So let's just think theoretically about what could be done with 20% of the $17.5 billion that taxpayers provide. If we were, since the schools are considering not providing the full 5 days of instruction, we could take the money that's for that fifth day of school and give it directly to families. And that would mean that each family in Washington state would get $3,500 per kid and with that money, they could certainly catch their kids up from the COVID learning loss. And that would do a tremendous thing for the children of Washington state and for the families.
Now, not that you haven't already brought enough to the table, Eve, but before I move on to our Center for the Environment Director, Todd, are there any other issues that have popped up or surprised you or that you think people should know about right away?
Well, I testified this morning on House Joint Resolution 4200, which is the fourth attempt by the state legislature to change the supermajority requirement for approving school construction bonds from 60% to 50%. Because after they increased the state property tax dramatically from, a couple of years ago, from $1.89 per $1,000 assessed value to $2.40 per $1,000 of assessed value. After they dramatically increased the state property tax, they want to increase it some more. And they're trying to basically lower the constitutional protections against passing debt, long-term debt on the people of Washington state for school bonds. And so they're trying again. We'll see. They have to get 2/3 majority in the legislature to pass this out of the legislature and then put it before voters. We'll see what happens. We had a rigorous debate about it this morning.
Fascinating. And I want to remind people, you can ask questions of Lee. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of our talks with our center directors, but put that question in the Q&A box anytime. Thanks, Lee. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Moving on to Todd Myers. He is our Center for the Environment Director. Todd, thanks so much for making the time, of course. And you've also been keeping track of how, because you're a guy who just is never satisfied with having enough to do. You've been keeping track of COVID testing and some of the way our state has been measuring results. Despite winning the Super Bowl a while back, the state still seems to be struggling. Tell us about the latest that you've found.
Well, as I said, in addition to the work I do on environment, I started looking at COVID testing. And the reason I started looking on COVID issues, the reason I started looking at it is that many of the same sort of statistical games and failures that we see in the environment were occurring in COVID and are the state's reaction to COVID. And so there's two things to point out. One is about the testing. And so the irony is that we have a vaccine mandate for some, but they say it's not a vaccine mandate, it's a vaccine mandate or a testing mandate that you could also test. But of course, tests are not widely available. And the timeline to get tested can be very long. So for instance, my family, we got tested and it took 2 days. To get back. So what do you do for those 2 days? You should be able to get it back fairly rapidly. The at-home tests, of course, are very difficult to find. And so the problem is that when you're trying to contain the spread, right, a lot of what we're focused on is containing the spread of COVID, and there are some good techniques. I am vaccinated, I've been vaccinated literally since the first day that I could get vaccinated. But what we're seeing now is vaccinations do not limit the spread. You can still get it, you can still transmit it with vaccinations. It's very good at keeping you healthy if you get it, that you don't go to the hospital and you don't die, but it's not good at containing the spread. So testing is one way that we contain the spread, to tell you quickly whether you know if you have it and whether you should quarantine and be careful around others. The second part of that is what's called contact tracing. And contact tracing is that when you have it, what the state will do is we'll reach out to you and say, all right, here's some things to think about now that you have it. Here, think about who you've come in contact with and who you need to talk to so that they don't inadvertently spread it, since you can have COVID for a while without realizing it. So contact tracing is voluntary. The state calls you. You don't have to answer. You don't have to give them anything. But I have had friends who received the calls and say it's very useful. Here's the problem. Washington State has had a goal of reaching 90% within 90% of people who test positive within 24 hours. The most recent report says that we reached 5%, not 90%, 5% is what we're doing right now. And it's not because, excuse me, people aren't responding. They're only even trying to call 9% of people. So even if everybody responded, only 9%, they would only reach 9%. The reason that all of this is important is we constantly hear from government about what a great job they're doing in containing the spread, and that we need to rely on them, and that they're following the science. But when you look at what their job, the things that they say are important to do to contain the spread, they do all of them badly. They don't make testing available. They don't do contact tracing. They don't do the things that they say are their job. But then the result is that we end up having to have more restrictions on us because they're not doing their job.
Why do you think this gets such, I mean, I know you've talked about it, and you've talked about it in the past, that, similar problems with this. Why do you think this isn't a more front and center problem that's addressed, in larger media and in policy discussions in Washington State? I mean, it just seems to, it doesn't even seem to exist as a problem, if unless you're, a fan of Washington Policy Center, right?
Yeah. I think there's a couple of reasons. One, I think it's mundane, right? I don't think contact tracing is very exciting, but it's very important, right? It could be a tool. Other countries, Korea actually had an incredible contact tracing system, and it helped them limit the spread pretty significantly. We have done it in a very ham-handed way. We're spending money and time on it, and we're doing it incredibly poorly. So I think it's a little bit mundane. Second thing is that every time the governor is asked about these sorts of failures, and he is rarely, let's just say, he's not asked very often, but whenever he is asked, what he says is, we have one of the lowest rates of death from COVID in the whole country. We won the Super Bowl of COVID. But the question is, why is that? What caused that? Utah has an even lower mortality rate from COVID than we do. And yet they didn't do many of the restrictive things that we did. So maybe we should have, by his logic, maybe we should have done what Utah did. But he would, of course, say that's ridiculous. No, there are other factors. That's exactly right. The reason that Washington State has a low mortality rate is for a variety of reasons that are completely unrelated to government restrictions. I wrote about it last year, looking at all of the things that people say contributed to that low mortality rate. And in every single one of the areas that people routinely highlight in terms of government responsibilities, we failed really poorly. What happened is that people took action. I can tell you that a week before the governor locked down, all the way back in the beginning of COVID, Seattle was empty. People were already self-quarantining because they were taking action. And really, the governor is taking credit for what individuals did.
It's fascinating to me how this story plays out when the governor's been featured so prominently nationally, but there's been problems with the national media on this subject as well. And before I let you go, Todd, is there anything on the environmental front, legislatively speaking, that people should be aware of?
So I'll just give you every once in a while for the last several years, I have been keeping people up to date on snowpack. Because what we hear, and actually in state law, it actually says that climate change is already causing declining snowpack. This grated on me because it's simply not true. 13 of the last 16 years, Washington State has seen above what they call normal snowpack. This year, we are well above. As of today, we're at 116% of normal snowpack. We still have we still have 2 more months of the snow year, but it's likely that we'll end up above snowpack normal. So I always point that out because predicting the impacts of climate change is very difficult. And so there was an article in the Spokesman Review that claimed that, we were seeing snowpack problems, and that even though this was a good year, it was abnormal and we're going to see worse in the future. And so somebody who reads my blog sent it to a Spokesman Review reporter, and the reporter said, no, I'm not going to consider that because it comes from a conservative think tank. So he had actually quoted left-wing environmental groups talking about how dangerous loss of snowpack was, even though it's not true, but wouldn't listen to the data that I was citing actually from the National Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is a US government agency that actually does the data. So that's, I think, it's really frustrating. If you have bad data, you make bad policy. You waste money and time on things that aren't really problems, or you exaggerate problems so that you can do policies that don't make any sense. And when we have reporters and others simply refusing to look at the data from the US government, it just shows sort of how climate change has become more of an identity politics type issue where people believe strongly, even if the data don't support it, rather than based in science.
And it also shows an unchecked bias, well, I can trust these people because I already agree with what they've concluded, whereas I'm suspicious of you. And I've seen you point out before, be suspicious of me. Here's the data from the government. Go look at it yourself, and hate me all you want, but the data is right there.
Not to go on too long, quick, but one of the things that the reporter actually responded was, well, we're seeing snow melt earlier. And that's what Todd didn't mention. It was like, okay, we can test that. We can look at the data. And guess what? Actually, that's not true. We're actually seeing snow melt later. And even in Spokane, meltdown is occurring later. So even the argument that he made, again, without any data, was wrong. So it just shows you sort of how ideology trumps science in a lot of these issues.
All right, thanks, Todd. We'll bring you back during the Q&A section. Now we're moving on to Elizabeth Hovde. She is the director for our centers for the Center for Worker Rights and for our Center for Healthcare. Elizabeth has been following very closely and has been instrumental in spreading the news about the new payroll tax for long-term care. Elizabeth, any updates to share on the long-term care payroll tax?
Yes, last week on Thursday, the House Appropriations Committee passed a bill that would delay implementation of the payroll tax 18 months. So instead of starting to see stuff come out of your check, money come out of your check for this program this month, as was dictated by the law, it would start in July of 2023. I'm not celebrating this because delaying a bad, horribly flawed law is not fixing the law. It's not taking another look at how to deal with our long-term care woes. So it's disturbing to me that these might get fast-tracked in a way that shuts down conversation about real solutions to the long-term care program and payroll tax.
And how, I know there's a number of people trying to put forward amendments that might delay or stop even indefinitely this particular program. Could you describe, first of all, why they're not just saying repeal it, and then also what some of these efforts are to put a stop to it?
Well, if you remember, this original law creating a program and starting a payroll tax to pay for it, 58 cents per $100 that you earn, was enacted in 2019 with broad Democratic support, the governor's support. They bragged about it. They were happy that this had passed and saw it as a solution the rest of the nation could look toward. And then as we're nearing it, and we've been talking about it, and there's been other news out about it, and the more people who learn about it don't like it, think it's an inadequate benefit, it's an inappropriate role of government. All of this outrage resulted in all of a sudden the Governor Inslee coming to our rescue from a bill that he bragged about and supported, and saying, we're going to delay it, don't worry, we're going to fix all the problems with the law. Some of those problems include if you want to retire out of state after you've paid into this program for years, many of your working years, or all of your working years, you will not be eligible for the benefit of $36,500. You need to be vested for 10 years, which also rules another whole group of people out. It rules, it's not, like I said, not portable. So people who work in Washington but live out of state will not see the benefit, and it goes on and on. So my fear with this delay that's been fast-tracked by the Democrats is that it does shut down repeal conversation. There were at least 3 repeal bills filed, and I've been told by the people who filed them that they will not be heard. So it's discouraging in that angle. I'm worried that by delaying it, just like when it was passed in 2019, people stopped talking about it. People really didn't know about it. People didn't get outraged about it. And if they delay it now, I think that's what they're hoping will happen again, that people will forget that this is a looming threat to their income and that it takes away choices that they can make with their own money about their own long-term care services, should they need it in the future.
And there's any concern expressed about the collapse of the individual market in Washington State for long-term care?
Yeah. I have some industry sources who have actually created timelines showing the dismantling of the industry, them shutting out people who were under 40, making the ability to get long-term care harder if you were older. There's been industry shutdown after industry shutdown on provisions of the law because they can't compete with the government program, and they weren't willing to offer inadequate care, which is what the government is doing. And it's really interesting because the government won't call this an insurance program sometimes when it works in their favor, and yet at other times and in their marketing, they talk about this being insurance and you pay a premium, not that you're being exacted a tax that you may or may not ever use. So there's confusion all around this thing. The bill needs to be repealed outright and not tweaked or delayed. It's going to be just as bad of a law in 18 months as it is now.
Thanks, Elizabeth. We'll bring you back for the Q&A section. I want to remind everybody, if you do have a question, you can ask it at any point. Just type it into the Q&A tool in Zoom. It's probably at the bottom of your screen or on the side of your screen, depending on how you have your viewer arranged. It's the little icon with the 2 conversation boxes if you're new to the format. For the rest of you, I'm sure it's old hat, but try not to put your questions in the chat function because it's easier for us to track the actual Q&A section by using that particular tool. So again, at any point you can put the Q&A, your questions in the Q&A box, and that'll be really helpful. Let's move on to Jason Mercier. He is our director for our Center for Government Reform and an all-around budget guru. Jason is here with us now. Jason, one of the things that you keep pointing out time and again is the money keeps flowing in Washington State. The coffers are very, very full. Any overall budget updates or observations regarding Washington State versus other states? Because I know that you've been calling for a state sales tax cut because we're awash with this money. Any movement or anything to report on that?
Thanks, Dave. So let me give you the good news and the bad news. The good news is Washington has never been in a better position to cut taxes. We've got a true $8 billion revenue growth above our budget that's available for tax cuts, spendings, savings. The money is there. And just on Friday, I got the December revenue collections. Those were up another 14% above the November forecast. The money is pouring in. So that's the good news. Let me give you the bad news. The governor has made it very clear he sees no need for tax cuts. The Democratic leadership have said, we've got just too many spending needs. So if we can't cut taxes in this climate, I don't think Washington ever will without a change in leadership. There have been multiple bills introduced by the Republicans that would do things like reducing the property tax, not repealing, but moving the manufacturing tax on the business and occupation for all manufacturers to the Boeing rate. There's actually a bill that passed in a bipartisan manner a few years ago, but the governor vetoed it. Lots of proposals to do other type of targeted tax cuts. But that's the phrase that you have to keep your ear on, because whenever the Democrats talk about it, it's targeted. We're not talking about the broad-based tax cuts that you're seeing proposed in California, New York, states across the country, just not Washington.
Other deep red states like California, New York. That is a mix of bad and good there. And it seems like, when you say 14%, on top of all the other increases that you've described over the past year, Washington's really sitting on an enormous amount of capital, and for all the talk of wanting to alleviate the burden on the lower income people of Washington State, sales tax being their biggest. I mean, it's amazing to me that there's not more public desire or outrage or media attention to this idea of getting that, of achieving that reduction in the overall tax rate there. What about in terms of government reform, emergency powers? Where are we on that? Is there any movement among the leadership, particularly because obviously, the minority has called for emergency powers reform for Governor Inslee, but has the majority called for any emergency powers reform to protect their own institutional prerogatives and their own representational powers?
So let me pull back the curtain on the glamorous life of a policy analyst. You can go to the bill introductions each day and you'll see the bills that have been introduced. But if you want to cheat, you can manually enter in bill numbers and you'll see what's coming up the next day. And I think the reason why you had me go on last year is because there's a bill that's going to drop tomorrow, introduced by the Senate Majority Whip, the Democratic leadership. And it's got a bill title that's got me super excited. It says legislative oversight of the governor's emergency powers, but the text is not posted yet. So I don't know. I've been refreshing that page every second for the last hour here. But we do know there's already been bipartisan bills proposed, House Bill 1772, Senate Bill 5039. And either of those bills, after whether 30 days or 60 days, would bring Washington back in line with the rest of the country and at least have some type of legislative oversight. The governor has all his powers. He can do what he's doing. But at some point in time, the legislature has to sign off on it. Neither of those bills have been given a public hearing yet. This new bill that I'm hoping I can be excited about, again, because it's sponsored by Democratic leadership, maybe that will be the one that actually moves. So stay tuned. And if you actually follow my Twitter handle, once that text posts, I'll have it in there.
All right. Looking forward to that. And let's keep our fingers crossed there. By the way, for those of you who don't keep track of WPC policy videos, we have a great animated series that you can find. It's called Picture This, on the playlist at the WPC YouTube channel, Washington Policy YouTube channel. And one of our videos is on emergency powers. We have the extended one and also a 60-second one that explains why we need emergency powers reform, easily found on our YouTube channel. It's actually been shared by a couple of different media outlets at this point, hasn't it, Jason?
Yeah, actually, we've had several editorials recommending what we've been proposing. And when they run those, they've actually put the video on their web pages.
Well, there you go. We made it easy for everybody to check that out. All right. So now I'd like to bring everybody forward. So we'll do our Q&A section so that everybody can ask any questions that they want of any of our panelists. You're welcome to do so. Lee Finne, Todd Myers, Elizabeth Hovde, and Jason Mercier here. Let's start with a question for Lee. Is it perhaps time to reinvent our public education system? I remember being in grades 9 through 12 and going from secondary school to higher ed, and it made high school feel like a joke. It actually brings up a decent point about how our school system was built and how long it's been, what it is today. Lee, is any talk about major reform?
I think it is way overdue, the time to reinvent our public education institutions. We have been going in the direction of more and more centralization, more distance between the people who make decisions that control what happens in the schools and the teachers. And this is a bad and less control over, no control for families over where the money goes. So the forward-looking states in this country are passing school choice legislation, which would give control, basically following the idea of funding the child, not the system. And there are now over 30 states, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, that give families control over a portion of their education dollars so they can actually choose the school that their child attends and send their child to a private school if that's a better fit. And that is the model going forward. And that will And all the research shows that improves the child gets a better education, whose family has control over their dollars. But then the kids left in the remaining traditional schools, they see their education improve, because there's nothing like competition to force change and improvement. And the public school system has no accountability, no competition. And this is why we're seeing the continuing lowering of academic standards and at a higher and higher cost. So what we're seeing is a logical outgrowth of the way we've organized our schools into a monopoly that gets more funding from the state every year and has no one holding it accountable.
Next question is for Todd. Todd, have you looked at House Bill 1838? And I'll just remind people now, there's so many bills that come forward in a legislative session. It's really easy to not know about 1, 2, 10, and you have to look them up. So this person asking the question does us all a service and points out what the bill is about. Todd, if you looked at House Bill 1838 from the Washington Farm Bureau, here are some specifics. It mandates large no-touch buffers on all private lands, providing few exceptions other than tribal lands, and is a regulatory taking of private property rights. Creates huge buffers as large as 250 feet on each side of a stream, river, or pond, lake, or wetland. Provides new fines up to $10,000 per day of violation issued by Ecology. It would likely replace the voluntary stewardship program and would create unfunded mandates for farmers and other landowners. Any comments, or have you heard of that particular bill, Todd?
Oh, yes. So Pam Lewison, who was our agriculture director, is actually writing about that, has a blog coming out today or tomorrow about it, that people should go to our webpage and look at. This is it's called the Lorraine Loomis Act, which is trying to reduce stream temperatures for salmon. That is a very good idea, but I think this is a really bad bill. I'll just give you a couple of reasons. One is that while farms and other rural areas are hit, the landowners take the costs, have to pay the costs of buying the trees, of losing the value of the land and things like that. One of the things we hear all the time is that restoring salmon is a societal benefit. It's good for all of us. And yet bills like this say, while it's good for all of us, only the people who happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time get to pay all of the costs. Society's not going to pay, only certain people are going to pay. It will allow a payment of some small amount, but not nearly the entire cost. If it benefits society, if salmon recovery is important, we should be willing to pay for it. If we're only willing to pay for it, or it's only important when somebody else pays for it, well, then it's not important. So I think that shows sort of the game that goes on here. There's another issue which related to the length, the size of the buffers, which is site potential height, and that is basically how tall a tree can be. So I dealt with this when I was at the Department of Natural Resources. This is basically the law that we have in forests. But what you find is the science says that the vast majority of the benefits from stream buffers come in the very first 50 feet. And yet what this would mandate is buffers of 150 feet or more. And that additional buffer does very little. But again, if you're not paying the costs, you don't care, you're willing to impose it. But I think the indication of sort of how disingenuous this is the fact that any stream that has a building or a road along it is exempted. So what does that mean? That the Duwamish in Seattle and that the Command Lake Cut and the Ship Canal are exempted. So in other words, if you have totally destroyed the habitat, absolutely obliterated it, don't worry, you're fine. If you have been a good steward, but we can, make slight improvement, we're going to stick it to you and you're going to have to pay for it. That is totally backwards as to how we should be protecting salmon. And I think that just gives you a sense of that this is more about sticking it to people who are easy prey, and that urban legislators are sticking it to rural areas rather than actually trying to help salmon. And it's very frustrating to me as a member of the Salmon Recovery Council. There's a lot we can do, but this sort of divisive attack on one community makes it really difficult to have durable, long-term salmon recovery rather than just making it a political game.
Thanks, Todd. The next
Other
question
than that, I don't have any feelings about it.
Next question is for Jason. How much government bureaucracy has been created in 2022 to prepare for collecting, processing, auditing, and enforcing capital gains income tax returns required to be filed in 2023, unless and until it's hopefully ruled unconstitutional?
Too much, because it's all for waste. This is clearly an income tax. I think the budget provided it. You know what? I'm not going to quote it because I can't remember, but money was provided to the Department of Revenue to set up the infrastructure to collect this tax. There is a summary judgment hearing on February 4th, and at that time, we should get a pretty good indication of where this is going. I will note the Attorney General does not like me. He does not like my research because he filed a brief with the court asking not only to strike my declaration, but everything I've gotten from public records from the Department of Revenue, from the IRS, and from all 50 states saying that this is an income tax. So, you know, you may not like the truth, but you can't hide it.
Did he have a reason for wanting to strike the public records request
Yes,
other than
yeah,
not wanting the public to see it?
Apparently, public records from Washington's Department of Revenue, a letter from the Internal Revenue Service, and documented correspondence with revenue directors across the state are hearsay.
It's an amazing development there, Jason. Appreciate that. Next question is for Elizabeth. If the long-term care tax starts to collect in mid-23, won't that make it a relevant issue in 24? That's our friend John Carlson asking, why not have a little delay? Any comment?
Yeah, I just worry that delay will quiet people and make them forget. There are border community people who say that's not going to happen, and I'm thrilled to hear that. But I think the energy against this is here now, and we're understanding the complication that it is now. And so I worry personally that delay will quiet the feeling of a need to fix the legislation, which I don't think can happen. I don't think you can fix this bill while keeping it solvent.
Thanks. There's a question up. Will we be receiving this recording? And let me just answer that real quickly myself. You won't receive it directly, in other words, unless you're subscribed to our email newsletter, where we often put featured videos in, and you might get it there. But it will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. So if you miss something, or if you want to share this video with friends or family, you can go to the Washington Policy Center's YouTube channel, and we upload it there. It does take a while because it's a pretty big video file, so it's usually within a couple of days, but it will be there available for you. We also try to move the audio. We'll be moving the audio to our podcast, so that might be another way. If you don't want to look at this beautiful face and you'd rather just listen. Since we're not using charts or something, forget about the wonderful special effects of this video, and you can just go the audio route. That makes it.
By the way,
fast too.
I did get the blue background screen memo. I just have a really old computer.
Yeah. Elizabeth just does old school stuff, so it's not possible for her. We have to get a screen for her to physically move down in the background for that. Real quickly for everybody, before I get to another question from you, and by the way, everybody feel free to put your questions in quickly in the Q&A box at the bottom of the side of your screen. Last year, I remember most of you were saying, hey, this session is unlike any I've ever been to before. There's just a lot of weird stuff going on, and I feel like the overreach is very powerful. I know we're very early on to the session, but how does it fit? How does it square with you so far? Does it feel like an improvement from last year, or an even deeper jump down that rabbit hole? Let's start with you, Jason.
Yeah, so I was actually just talking with Todd about this morning, that, cutoff is a week out and the bills are kind of light. So as far as the flow of bill, even though my colleagues may think I'm crazy saying it hasn't been too busy, it's not as many bills as I was anticipating. So that feels more like a traditional off-year session, with the exception of when that budget comes out, because the governor is not proposing a supplemental budget. He is proposing an entirely new rewrite of this budget. So when the revenue forecast comes out on February 16th, you may see this really get a lot more hectic.
Todd?
Yeah, I would sort of agree with Jason, although I don't know, I feel busy. I think there's a lot of silly bills. The act that we just did about the stream buffers, there's another one to reform the Growth Management Act. There's a bunch of bills to increase subsidies for solar panels, in addition to the 78 subsidies we already have for solar panels. 79 and 80 are going to be great. The governor wants subsidies for electric vehicles. There's a lot of really silly stuff. And so, yeah, I sort of agree that the number of bills isn't as crazy, but there's still a lot of stuff that would really have negative impact. And the other frustrating thing is that when are we going to get to the point where we do good bills? That's what I want to know is that a lot of these issues are worth addressing. I'm all for addressing stream temperatures, but we seem to find a way to do it in the worst and most divisive way possible rather than something that's collaborative and effective. And that's, I think, what was frustrating, even though the number of bills may be not so crazy.
Elizabeth, or Leave, anything to add?
Well,
I'm just seeing a cascade of bills related to long-term care. So that feels different than last session. And there's some reprisals of things that are coming up again, like the soda tax and some drug price controls. So this session actually feels like last session to me, but with a lot more long-term care focus and everyone kind of looking in that direction.
Leave?
I would say that I've never seen a bill before that would cut out a Friday from the school week. and at the same time, they want to provide universal preschool. They want to reduce the high school graduation requirements so you could just have to perform your knowledge. They want to put a student on the State Board of Education with full voting rights. They want to, continue CRT curriculum. They are lowering the academic standards across the board, and I just see a lot of bills. I can't fight them all. It's impossible for one person. It's not encouraging at all, and I don't see any good bills yet being given a hearing. The ones that would give families direct control over the money, like House Bill 1886 by Representative Walsh, that would give families $10,000 to use on the education of their child in a private school. Now, there's a positive bill that would help a lot of families in this state. And that bill, who knows if it will even get a hearing. So
that brings me to our next. Oh, go ahead, Jason.
I was just going to say, after hearing all our other directors, it's become clear I have become numb to the shock and awe of the Washington legislature.
That happens. That happens. All right, Leave. Next question is for you. In states that allow state educational funding to follow the child, has there been a corresponding increase in new private schools opening up? And what type of outcomes do these new schools have on the whole? Who's responsible for tracking results?
I haven't tracked those numbers, but I have seen a growth of all kinds of innovative ideas for schooling. They call them tiny schools, remote learning pods. There's a great deal of interest in homeschooling now. Many more people are looking out to figure out a way to educate their own children. So I'm seeing a growth of that dramatically. So who's responsible for tracking if the kids are actually learning? It's the parents, not the state, not some school official. That's the COVID school shutdown made it crystal clear to parents that no one's watching out for their education of their children. No one cares like the parents about getting the kids the skills and knowledge they need. And so giving parents control over the money is the logical outcome of the COVID school shutdown, where parents were shown they were powerless. They could not open the schools, no matter how much their kid was hurting. They couldn't get the schools open. So with this realization comes responsibility, and I'm seeing families demanding a lot more power over this education of their children. That's what I see positive coming out of the COVID school shutdowns. And you're seeing parents show up to testify on these bills in record numbers. That's what I'm seeing. That's a new phenomenon. There was a bill to lower the mandatory age to 5 years old to go to school in public, here in Washington State. I didn't testify on it, but you should have seen the parents that came out in opposition to that. Because they say this would foreclose my deciding maybe to homeschool, this forcing me to get into the public school system at age 5 is too soon for my child. It's good to have the decision delayed until the child is 8 is good for the child. And there were many parents that came and testified very effectively, and I think they persuaded the chair to drop the bill. So
We, as a parent of school age kids, I gotta say too, this COVID era among my friend groups and circles, it's really shown that school is no longer reliable. You know, it's not only what the quality is, it's that you can't even rely on it. So this might not be something I can continue to have my kid do because I can't even guarantee it's going to be there from 1 week to the next.
Well,
and part of that is COVID.
And yes, and that is an outgrowth of COVID. The union has figured out they can close the schools overnight. No one will stop them. And so that's the message to parents is no one's on your side here. You're going to have to be responsible for this child's education yourself. And
exactly.
That feeling isn't going away. That is just, watch out for that.
Next question's for you, Jason. What can we do to improve the elections process to help voters make better decisions and hold elected leaders accountable?
I don't know, maybe that's a better question for Todd. He's got the political consulting background.
But on the environment, so I actually have my book, which is coming out in November. So put it on your list. It makes a wonderful Christmas present, even though it's January. That's exactly what my book is about, is that outsourcing the environment and other issues to politicians and hoping that they have the right incentives to make good decisions, I think in many cases a fool's errand. We talked earlier about COVID and the fact that the things that the government is doing to fight COVID don't work. They're very ineffective. They fail. We've seen that with Results Washington. The governor set up a system to set targets and then manage to those targets for CO2 emissions reductions and salmon recovery and other things. And we've missed all of those targets because the incentives and the accountability are poor. That the way to change that is to empower individuals, to give them more control over improving the environment, taking care of their healthcare, other things like that. Education is another great one, where you align the accountability and the incentives with the outcomes. And that's what my book is about in terms of the environment. That's the way to do it. It doesn't mean, right, I'm not an anarchist. I'm not wearing black today, so I don't believe no government. Of course, I've worked for government agencies. I see the value in them. But to the extent that we can empower people to make those decisions for themselves and then help the environment and healthcare and education, you're going to get those better outcomes. And I'll just add this one last thing. I have a series of videos with tribes across Washington State about their stewardship of natural resources. And the reason I did that is because tribes on their reservation, one, they have incentives to manage well, whether it's fisheries or wildlife or forests, but they're also accountable. If they fail, their tribal members come to them and say, hey, why are you letting my house burn down? Why aren't there more fish? And so I think it's a really good example of what can be done when you give people incentives and accountability to care for the environment. And so if you haven't watched those videos, I really recommend them because tribes are actually, when they are in control of their land, they do really good stuff.
Well, Todd, the tribes are just like the parents, you put the parents in charge of the education of their children and their forests will blossom and grow. It's the same sort of thinking.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And let me add to the question there. You can also share Washington policy information, as we alluded to a couple of different times. Sometimes the public just doesn't know. I mean, if certain things aren't covered, if certain questions aren't asked, if data is not looked at, you can only go by the statements of other politicians. And so, if you've got social media accounts and other friends, we have publications. Our blog is free. Our research is free. Take it, share it, clip it. and do so in a respectful way. And so, spreading that information, I do think is helpful. Real quickly, because we're almost out of time, Jason, any comment on redistricting?
I know that it doesn't sound like anything radical is going to change from what the commission adopted, because it takes that 2/3 vote of the legislature, and it doesn't sound like leadership is trying to push through any type of changes.
Okay. We have a question from Jerry. Is there any movement on the tax on miles driven per year, the mileage tax? The answer to that is yes, but Maria Frost is not here, but she's writing about it, and is actually, I think, go
Let me
ahead,
just
Todd.
say that's House Bill 2026. I saw that question. Maria, if you go to Maria's Twitter feed at Maria Frost, spelled MARIYAFROST, she actually has a good Twitter thread on that very issue, so that you can look at it.
Great. Yeah, thanks. I talked to her today, and she's going to blog about that thread too, but probably tomorrow because she's off today. And before we close, Todd, one very important question's come up. Is your book available for pre-order?
Not yet. I appreciate the question. And believe me, I will be flogging my book pretty heavily later this year, but it comes out in November. So, but yeah.
Yeah. So, but he's just priming the pump right now, just getting you ready, getting you excited about it. I want to thank all of our center directors, Lee Finne, Jason Mercier, Todd Myers, and Elizabeth Hovde for coming on and doing this with us. So every other Tuesday during the legislative session, on the alternative Tuesdays, we'll have legislative lunchbox series with Chris Cargill. He'll talk with legislators. All legislators from both parties have been invited to participate, but we'll see who shows up. But that gives you a chance to talk with the representation in Olympia about what's happening there as well. So Washington Policy on the Go every other week. We'll talk with our center directors, get updates from them. And I want to thank them for participating today, and thank you for being here and being a part. Again, the video will be available on our YouTube channel coming up. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.